Messenger from Seneca here today, presenting today on terrorism financing risks and MSBs. So, what did you get told was the schedule or the time frame for your presentation? You still on for finishing at 2:40?
Yes, it should be finished by 2:40. I think I'm a few minutes behind. Schedule. I can make my presentation slightly shorter if needs be.
Yeah, just 5 minutes. So I don't want to take up any more of your time. You're good to go, and let you handle it all by yourself.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me. As Joseph mentioned, my name is Ian Messenger. I'm a professor at Seneca College, and I specifically teach the anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing program. I also teach at Dalhousie University on a more targeted course on terrorism more broadly. So today, if I can share my
Hey, Dr. Messenger. Ian, we lost you. Your voice somehow. Check your mic. Hello? The mic is,
Yeah, the moment I started sharing my presentation, let me try one more.
Let's see what happens. Yeah.
Hear me now?
Hi, Ian. Can you refresh, please? Oh, can you hear him?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear him now.
Okay, perfect. That's good. Thank you.
The mistake I made was I pressed share audio when I shared my screen, and that seemed to cut off. So I shall start again. So my name's Ian Messenger. I'm a professor of anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing at Seneca College. I also teach at Dalhousie University on a much broader course on global and domestic terrorism. So today, this presentation, I'm going to focus on the issue of terrorism financing, specifically how it relates to MSBs. So if I can give you a brief introduction of how this session will run, a very, very brief further introduction about who I am, some of the high-level learning outcomes, and the key piece of this presentation is talking about how terrorist financing differs from money laundering. And the reason why I introduced this section is really because money laundering is the bread and butter of compliance. Everyone should at least know how money laundering works, but the issue of terrorism financing is often slightly less well known, and it does open itself up to, as we'll see later in the presentation, significant harms. We'll look at several different types of terrorism, and I introduced this section largely to show the wide range of potential customers or clients that your MSBs might interact with who have a terrorist financing agenda. For context, we'll talk about the relative cost of terrorist events, and I think you'll all be surprised at what we talk about there. And we'll look at, finally, some of the red flags as provided by FinTrack when it comes to terrorist financing or the financing of terror. And then finally, we'll look at the key actions of a compliance officer within an MSB. What should they do if they suspect terrorist financing? So firstly, we'll cover who I am. So as I said, I'm a professor at Seneca College and also instruct online at Dalhousie University. Prior to moving into academia, I was in law enforcement in the UK, where I spent 10 years working predominantly on terrorist financing and money laundering investigations with an international reach. Having moved to Canada in 2016, I pivoted into academia, and that's where I've been ever since. So learning outcomes for this particular session, as I say, we'll talk about the difference between money laundering and terrorist financing. We'll cover some of those red flags of the funding of terrorism, and we'll understand the responsibilities and key actions for compliance officers. So the key point of this presentation is really to explore how money laundering and terrorist financing is different. And I think going from the perspective of money laundering, we all, I think, have an understanding that money laundering deals with the proceeds of crime. It deals with the placement, layering, and integration of illicit funds to make them appear clean. So we have basically the proceeds of crime, criminal conduct. That is our purpose. With terrorist financing, whilst it can be criminal conduct, the proceeds of criminal conduct, it can also be legitimate income as well. Because if we look at the motivations of terrorist financing, they're very different from money laundering. Money laundering, as I say, making those illicit funds appear clean, whereas terrorist financing is basically to fund an act of terror. It doesn't make a distinction between if the source of funds is illicit or legitimate. So a good distinction between money laundering and terrorist financing is money laundering is the proceeds of crime, so the crime's already been committed, and with terrorist financing, the proceeds for crime, so the crime is yet to occur, the terrorist event is yet to occur. If you take nothing away from this presentation, that's my two phrases that always help clarify. If you're holding on with the presentation and you'd like to go further, we'll have a look at the stages of terrorist financing and money laundering. So money laundering, I'm not going to spend time. We know, I think, money laundering, 3 stages: placement, layering, integration. It's a linear process. So placement always has to occur in order to get the proceeds rolling, or the ball rolling, as we say. With terrorist financing, we have here what's called the terrorism resourcing model, and this is a five-stage process. Depending on the nature and the scale of the terrorist organization, not all steps have to actually take place, and they don't have to occur in order. And I'll shortly be explaining what I mean by that. So the first stage is acquisition. So acquisition is very much similar to placement in some respects, that it's the collection of resources. It's the individual contributor collecting resources or contributing resources. Then we have the aggregation stage, which, depending on the nature of the terrorist organization, the scale, you may or may not see this stage. And this stage is really where all the individuals involved in acquisition pool the funds in a central point of contact. So this may be a point of contact for a territory or a jurisdiction who has responsibility for fundraising and then remitting the funds to the terrorist organization. So in terms of transactional activity, you may see a lot of fund transfers being requested to a common individual within your jurisdiction. Once all these funds have been pooled in these single points of contact, those funds then have to be transferred over to the terrorist organization. So this particular step here, where the funds move from a point of contact to the terrorist organization, this is the step where you may start to see those international transfers. Those international transfers, specifically to countries which are in conflict zones or neighboring neighboring to conflict zones, or are countries which feature on the route to said conflict zone. At this particular point, transmission to the terrorist organization is quite high level. We're talking about the funds going directly into the general bank account of terrorist organization Inc. At this point, we don't necessarily have a funding of a specific terrorist action, we simply have the funds being moved to under the control of the terrorist organization. When the terrorist organization is ready to fund an activity, they have the internal step of transferring the funds to a terrorist operational cell. And it's this operational cell which typically will be responsible for carrying out the act of terror. Finally, the fifth stage is obviously the terrorist operational cell has these funds now. They now need to convert the funds into the specific resources or tools that they need to commit the act. So this could be, taking the funds and purchasing chemicals or goods or services, visas, or are also bribery and corruption aspects in order to facilitate their action. The key point here is that it's not always a linear process. We could certainly see the funds moving within the terrorist organization back between stages 3 and 4. You might have multiple conversions as well. So very different from the linear process that occurs in money laundering. As I said earlier on, smaller organizations, if they do not have the same kind of command and control or the complex structures, they may not actually be a higher level terrorist organization controlling multiple cells. It may simply just be one operational cell. At this point, you may just see those funds potentially moving domestically or internationally from single points of contact or individual acquirers directly to the terrorist operational cell. What does this mean for money service bureaus? It means that your oversight or your ability to conduct name screening or negative news on the beneficiaries is much more challenging, because often with terrorist organizations, those names or variations or permutations of those names will feature as fuzzy matches in name screening software, your world checks, your RDC. Obviously, it's not that common for funds to be sent directly to ABC Terror Inc. It's often through third parties or affiliated organizations, but you do tend to see those organizations featuring in some adverse media. The challenge with funds being sent directly to an operational cell is the beneficiaries within operational cells tend to be individuals. They tend to be just named individuals, and that can be much harder to identify. So we really have to draw on a number of the other potential indicators and red flags that we'll look at later. Obviously, with the smaller organizations, we still see the conversions. We still see the utilization of those funds into the items that they need to conduct the event. Another scenario that we experience is the lone wolf terrorist, and this is a particular scenario which MSBs may not see too much of, because simply it's funds moving from person A, so funds being acquired and then funds being utilized. So this would really occur outside of the MSB scenario. But I show it just to really highlight the nuances of terrorist financing, that there are differences. Not every stage applies. It's important, I think, next to talk about the types of, very, very high level, talk about the types of terrorism, because you certainly, if you watch the media, you read the newspapers, there are certain types of stereotypical terrorism that gets media attention, that gets publicized, and that tends to feed into the public consciousness and the consciousness of the compliance officer when they're looking for potential financing of terror. So here I mentioned a few of the 4 examples of terrorism that we cover in more broad terrorism courses. So we have Islamic terrorism. This is a typical media favorite. This is the one that gets the airtime. It gets the disproportionate amount of attention. But then we also have Christian fundamentalism and terrorism. Some examples of this particular type include the anti-abortion movement in the United States. We also have state and anti-state terrorism. This is often where, if we're talking about state terrorism, acts of terrorism committed by agents or actors of the state or of the government, and anti-state terrorism, other side, typically individuals seeking to overthrow governments or overthrow elected authorities, which I would hypothesize if your MSB was involved in a potential overthrowing of a government, that would be a bit of a reputational risk for your MSB. And finally, ideological and political terrorism. So this is your typical left-wing, right-wing terrorism. The actual acts themselves, very much the same, but it's ideologically driven. Moving on quickly to the cost of terrorist events, and why I show this particular example, and if there was more time, I could spend hours talking about this, simply to show that terrorism is not an expensive activity by any means, relative to the impact. And what does that mean for MSBs? It means that when we consider money laundering, we look at money laundering through a certain lens. We expect certain values. We expect certain levels of criminal profit. With terrorist events, because we're simply looking to fund an act of terrorism, it's relatively inexpensive to commit an act of terrorism. For example, the estimated cost for the 9/11 terrorism attacks has, the values vary wildly, but around about $500,000 USD is typically what's attributed to that terrorist attack. In 2004, the bombing of a train in Madrid, Spain, was estimated at USD $10,000. Very, very, very cheap. We look at the 2005 London Underground bombings, very close to my heart, estimated to have cost only 11,000 USD, if we consider the amount of carnage, death, and destruction that occurred there. If we think to another example which got a lot of attention at the time, was the Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi, Kenya. This is a very high-end shopping mall frequented by expats, middle class individuals. This particular terrorist attack involved approximately 4 gunmen, so four terrorists, and the siege of the mall led to 71 people being killed and around about 175 people being injured. So with those three numbers, I should say, bear that in mind. Very, very low number of individuals, but a very, very high death and injury rate, all for 5,000 USD. That's literally all it cost to do that. We look at the Boston Marathon bombing. So the bombing of the Boston Marathon, two brothers who were self-radicalized, used basically modified pressure cooker devices to stage explosions at the end of the Boston Marathon. So in this particular example, 3 individuals were killed and upwards of 264 people were injured by 2 brothers using pressure cookers for 500 USD. And the reason I use certainly these last 2 examples is to show that the value of funds which might be passing through an MSB or any other financial institution, it's unlikely in many cases to set off alarm bells or to attract attention, because these types of values probably not that uncommon to be remitted through a money service bureau. Please do ask questions as you go. I've seen some questions from the usual suspects. Also, feel free to send me softball questions. Always a big fan of the easy ones as well. So to just recap some of the differences and the similarities of money laundering and terrorist financing. So they're both multi-stage. They all have, in case of money laundering, 3 stages. With terrorist financing, anywhere from 2 to 5, depending on how we're doing this. The methodologies and the techniques used to move the funds through MSBs and through any other type of financial actor can be the same. So with money laundering, we have those tried and tested, those well-known topologies. Money laundering can take any form. With terrorist financing, those same tried and tested methodologies will also appear for the funding of terror. Obviously, that there may not be that concern about the source of funds if it's from a legitimate source, but also it could also just be simple remittances between individuals from person A to person B, less likely to attract attention. What is different between the two is the motivation. So as we discussed in one of the earlier slides, and if you felt the need to continue up to this point, we see that the motivation is different. So money laundering, proceeds of crime, very much trying to deal with proceeds of crime that have come from a predicate offense, whereas with terrorist financing, it's prior to the actual crime being committed. So if there's 2 phrases that really you want to stick in your mind, proceeds of crime versus proceeds for crime. And we say proceeds for crime because it really highlights the fact that the crime hasn't occurred yet, so the crime potentially can be stopped. And this is really where, as an MSB or any other type of payment processor, if you're able to intercept or stop that payment, you might be able to mitigate some of those statistics that we looked at in the previous slide. One of the key differences also is, as I say, the movement of funds is not linear. So we showed that funds can move between different actors in the terrorist financing stage. What does that mean from a compliance officer perspective? It means that it's especially important to not rely on the legitimacy of source of funds. Too often, in the case of terrorist financing, compliance officers mitigate their concerns or discount their concerns because the source of funds is okay. The source of funds is legitimate. The customer or the client can produce a payslip or a bank stub showing that it's earned income or it's not of a money laundering concern. Whereas hopefully you'll have seen that the issue of the source of funds in terrorist financing very different from money laundering. Scale is often different as well, and as I alluded to before, that the lower values of funding in terrorist financing, because the values are much smaller, they're less likely to attract attention purely by the numbers themselves. Certainly by the figures. If we look at, say, the those attacks, even those attacks that cost 11,000 USD, if they were funded by multiple individuals remitting small amounts, it's very, very challenging to identify those in any sort of transaction monitoring system. And a final difference here, and I've purposely not covered it in depth in this presentation, is that terrorist financing is not always financial. And this is more just a point of interest for yourselves, is that the funding of terrorism, it can be money, like we would expect to move through MSBs, through financial institutions, but it can also be resources as well. So you might have someone acquiring or aggregating resources, and it's not them controlling a bank account and pooling money. They're pooling vehicles or weapons or safe houses or any kind of instrument involved in logistics. And finally, moving into just some of the red flags, I think these shouldn't necessarily come to too much of a surprise considering what we've talked about. So really focusing on your high-risk jurisdictions. So are transactions or remittances being sent to or attempted to be sent to jurisdictions that are near conflict zones or in proximity to those conflict zones? So not just those typical countries where you know there's conflict going on, but those countries around as well, those transit countries. And my key takeaway from this perspective is that compliance officers should have a good awareness. I wouldn't say expertise, but awareness of what's going on in the world. We also see lots of terrorism being financed by charities or pseudo charities. So this is really where your external research, your name screening can be effective at identifying potential charities which have come to attention, or sounds like charities as well. It's not uncommon for terrorist organizations to set up companies or charities with similar sounding names as a means to legitimize or attempt to legitimize those transactions. Again, you see the bottom example from FinTrack, very much focusing on your adverse media. So have these individuals been identified by the media, law enforcement? Do they have connections to countries of concern? Again, very much.
Dr. Ian?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind just wrapping up in the next minute or so?
Yep, of course. I can talk about this for too long, I'm afraid. But again, final few flags here. Information coming from a wide range of sources will help you build a picture of the transactions. So from whether it be the media, law enforcement, or your name screening lists, this is certainly something to bear in mind and to have compliance officer skills. Moving on finally to the key actions for any compliance officer. Have a strong awareness of your internal MSB or financial institutions procedures for escalating potential terrorist financing. Be aware of the type of terrorist financing risks that your client base might pose. So do you have a specific demographic that interacts with certain high-risk countries which are near conflict zones? As a compliance officer, have an awareness of what's going on in the world. I think that's my key takeaway. Know your KYC if you have CDD for individuals. That can sometimes be a help, less extent in MSBs. But if in doubt, if there's any concerns that there might be transactions related to terrorism, then escalate them to the appropriate bodies. I think that was just under a minute there, Joseph. But if there's time for any questions, I'll happily take them.
Unfortunately, we don't have any time. Jennifer's ready to go, and we're already 3 minutes behind. But like I said in all the other presentations, you've got Dr. Ian's Messenger's email address there. He provided it, thankfully. If you need to reach out to him and you don't have his email address and want to connect, feel free to send an email to info@canadianmsb.org, and we'll connect you up with Dr. Ian Messenger. And thank you very much. I was only here for about